One day, about 18 months after you were born, you looked in a mirror and for the first time in your life you thought, yo, I think that might be me, bro. And a few years after realizing that you exist, some absolute donut comes along and breaks the news that it's only a temporary arrangement. And so you spend the rest of your life knowing that in an unknown number of seconds it will be death o'clock and you will stop existing. There are a few common things people do to deal with the weight of this knowledge. A. Boatloads of narcotics. B. Become so insufferably annoying that you will live on forever in people's memories. Or C. Devote your life to creating things that will outlast you. And if you don't have the nuts to commit to one of these options, you can go for option D, which is just nicotine and Netflix. However, no matter what you do, terror management theory says that you do it because of a deep-rooted fear of death. In a whole bunch of studies between 1990 and 2006, terror management theorists found that when made aware of their own mortality, people are more likely to buy Gucci flip-flops, show greater support for people with similar worldviews, show harsher judgments towards those who challenge their worldview, believe in gods, avoid using sunscreen or scheduling medical checkups, and support violence towards outgroups. So if you find yourself arguing with trolls on Twitter after this video, you know why. But could it be true that the reason we work so many bullshit jobs with bullshit bosses and buy so many bullshit t-shirts and stamp our names on so many half-baked causes is because deep down, somewhere in the depths of our psyches, we're just terrified of dying? The samurais in feudal Japan lived by a code called Bushido. It emphasized these principles. Their moral code was so strong that if they broke Bushido, get this, they would dress up in white clothes, write a death poem, and then stab themselves in the stomach before having a friend decapitate them with a katana. They would rather die than be dishonored. The practice was called seppuku, and they did this for hundreds of years. Fast forwards to August 29th, 1921, and a guy called Yukio Seki was born. Yukio was a bright student in school, and he had dreams of flying planes for a living. Terror management theory would likely tell you it was because defying gravity gave him a sense of symbolic immortality or something, but whatever the reason, the boy loved planes. And at the age of 17, he achieved his dream, becoming a pilot in the Japanese Navy. Then a year later, the craziest thing happened. By 1944, Japan was losing ground in the Pacific, and following orders from Vice Admiral Takahiro Onishi, a 23-year-old Yukio led a squadron of explosive-filled A6M Zeroplanes into battle. And after sighting a US escort carrier ship, Yukio nosedived his plane into it. And not just Yukio, 3,800 kamikaze pilots met a similar fate on purpose, despite knowing that the war was already likely lost. Hey, terror management theory, what do you think about that? Or what about the monk who set himself on fire as a form of protest? Or the US Air Force guy who did the same thing in Washington this year? Or the millions of people who have died in medieval battle running headfirst into a literal wall of spears? Or the countless religious fanatics who have sacrificed themselves for a cause they thought was bigger than themselves? What about David Goggins, who ran an ultramarathon with pneumonia and broken legs? What about the willing martyrs? What about Socrates, who allowed the state of Athens to execute him on false charges of corrupting the youth when he could have just moved to a different city? You know, Socrates, the same guy who purposefully married the most annoying woman he could find in order to challenge himself. If self-preservation was the primary human motivator, would any of these things have actually happened? No, we don't want to merely preserve ourselves. Fundamentally, we want to thrive, to become powerful and free. And most of the time, death just gets in the way of that, so of course we avoid it. Unless you're a martyr, in which case it actually helps your cause and so you willingly choose it. According to Nietzsche, a strong will to self-preservation was actually a sign of the distress and weakness of an organism. So what about all those terror management theory studies? It seems that no matter which way you spin it, the knowledge of our death is a corrosive on our souls. But is the fear of death even rational? Yes, it's purely rational, and that's why it's nonsense. Hear me out. Animals are not rational, and yet it's bonkers to suggest that animals are afraid of death. They're afraid of stuff that kills them, sure, but they're not afraid of death, for without the ability to conceptualize, the concept of death never occurs to them. A deer is not aware of its own mortality, it just knows that when a lion runs after it, its day is about to get significantly worse, so it runs away. All the diplomatic deers already died off, but humans, Humans are different. We are uniquely aware of our own existence. We have friends and family members who die, and from our perspective, they don't exist anymore, and so we say, yes, at some point I too will be non-existent. But what we miss is that it's impossible to be non-existent, since to be is a statement of existence. At the very moment that the light of your consciousness ceases to shine, there will no longer be anyone there for death to happen to. You cannot be dead, that's an oxymoron. You can only ever be alive. Your own death is quite literally not your problem. People who live in fear of their own death go their whole lives afraid of something that never happens to them. Your death is outside your jurisdiction. The only thing that's your problem is your life and what you do in it. But Angela, if my death isn't my problem, why don't I just down 8 pints of Stella and break 100 miles per hour on the back roads? This is why we have suffering, so that we don't sabotage our ability to thrive by doing something stupid like dying. And as Einstein said, dying is like super counterproductive, bro. Suffering allows us to avoid death without having to do a cost-benefit analysis of every single action that we take. Instead, when we stand on our brother's fucking Legos again, a neat little instinct called pain tells us that that was not a beneficial event, so we remove our foot from the little death cube. Suffering and pleasure make it possible for animals to survive so that they can continue thriving without even knowing what survive actually means. And then you have humans, built on the same wet tech stack as animals, except with this one extra module that means we now know that we die. And yet we still experience suffering and pleasure, just the same as our ancestors. And the combination of these two pieces of knowledge, that we suffer and that we also die, has led us to the conclusion that suffering is meaningless. We know we aren't suffering for eternal redemption or heaven, and as Nas put it, life's a bitch and then you die, that's why we get high. Suffering indicates to an organism that current events are hindering their ability to thrive, and pleasure indicates the opposite. Therefore, if we suffered, but we were not aware of death and therefore could not directly avoid it, this would make sense. Alternatively, if we were aware of death and therefore could directly avoid it, but did not ever need to suffer, this would also make sense. The human condition is that we are aware of death. We directly avoid it, and yet we suffer as well. This does not make sense, or at least we can't make sense of it, as evidenced by the fact that suffering and mortality take center stage in every major religion. You could even see much of the religion and philosophy of history as attempts to address the coexistence of suffering and death. We had some religions in the West that say, we'll happily suffer because we will not die. Then some religions in the East said, we'll happily die, because we will not suffer. Then those who unalive themselves say, I just simply refuse to suffer and die, so I will just die and then I will not suffer. So how do we reconcile the two? Religions tend to either reject death and accept suffering, or reject suffering and accept death. I tend to prefer those that reject death, because I don't believe your death is your problem anyway. However, the fact that your suffering is your problem is not up for debate at all, so good luck rejecting it. And as Naval said, it's easier to achieve your material desires than to renounce them. I think the reason humans have struggled to justify the coexistence of suffering and death for so long is because we haven't fully digested the knowledge of our mortality. We know that it will happen, but we can't imagine it. We imagine being aware of eternal nothingness or picture a black screen forever, but we're still imagining consciousness. We conceptualize dead as a sort of state that we can be in, even though we will not be at all. But we simply can't picture that. As a result, we see our deaths as a bad thing, something confusing and scary, and we avoid thinking about it at all costs. We might logically know it will happen, but we emotionally reject it. Even thinking about it makes us feel uneasy, as evidenced by those TMT studies. But if you really give death your full attention and don't shy away from it, you realize that your mortality is a state that you are currently in, not some distant scary event that might happen in the future. Just like the deer, evolution has programmed us to be so afraid of the stuff that kills us: social exclusion, hunger, violence. So ask yourself, if you really accepted your death and embodied your mortality without an ounce of emotional resistance, would you live differently? If you saw life itself as a suicide mission and were okay with that, what risks would you take? Would you really be afraid to talk to that cute girl at the bar, or ask for a raise, or start that new business opportunity? Would you really see life as pointless? Or would the stuff of life become the point of life? And what about suffering? Would you run away from it, or accept it as the price of admission? Would you fear it, or would you revel in it as a reminder that you're still alive? It's worth asking yourself this because it happens to be true. Life is a suicide mission. It's already gonna kill you. And until you accept that without flinching, you will resort to self-preservation. You'll be timid, afraid, risk-averse. You'll sit on the fence and sacrifice what could have been had you lived with the urgency that mortality demands. The conveyor belt of time is steadily moving you toward death, and one day soon you'll be 70 and you'll see it on the horizon. That's the moment that it will feel real, and that's the moment it will be too late to do anything about it. Until you know that you will never experience your own death, you will never fully digest your mortality. And until you digest your mortality, you will never fully live. There's a famous quote that says, "Don't take life so seriously. You'll never make it out alive." But I see it differently. I say take life seriously. I say engage, because you will never make it out at all.